Hey, what's up, Seekers? Welcome back. In today's class, we're going to put the final touches on this question of Maimonides and mysticism. I hope you enjoy for what is going to be something of an in-depth excursion into Maimonides' thought, his theology, and philosophy. There's one final question to ask when examining the question of Maimonides and mysticism, and that is, did Maimonides believe that the human could actually reach and know God? The reason this is an important question is because if we take mysticism, at least in the Abrahamic context, to mean something like union or direct communion with ultimate reality, or God, then a fundamentally ineffable, unreachable God does not seem a very good candidate to unite with or be in direct communion with. To what extent then can the individual reach, know, and experience God, according to Maimonides? And here we get down into the fine print in the debate about Maimonides' mysticism. Did Maimonides believe that one could know and unite with something metaphysical, something beyond the physical realm that we exist in? And if so, which metaphysical entity does he believe that the aspiring seeker can know and unite with? Is it an entity which can be considered divine, God or ultimate reality, making this union properly mystical in nature, a unio mystica? Let's back up a little and explain what's going on here. We began in the 7th class in the series to explain Maimonides' cosmology, his theory of the structure of the cosmos with its concentric spheres and accompanying separate intellects, up until the final sphere governing the sublunar realm with its intellect, the active intellect as it's known, the final separate intellect by which us humans, according to Maimonides, are able to cognize reality up from the most mundane forms of cognition through to philosophical contemplation, onto meditating on the supernal forms and cosmic intellects, all the way up to the prophetic experience of full union with the active intellect and the mind of God, the deepest moment of religious ecstasy in which the individual reaches a state of immortality and is transformed in a process of angelification, as we explained, into the active intellect itself, becoming part of the cosmic chain of intellects for all eternity. Building on what we presented in that 7th class, we continued in the 8th to explain the way by which union and cognition works according to Maimonides. The mechanisms of his knowledge and union, briefly stated, is that for Maimonides, as for Aristotle, the intellect has no character or nature of its own, but simply takes on the form of whatever it's cognizing, becoming identified with that which it is contemplating, and when the right conditions are in place, namely the unceasing attention of contemplation and the absence of matter or materiality in the thinker and the object of thought, that union becomes a complete and perfect one, as we elaborated in that class. Therefore, when the individual is properly contemplating God via the active intellect, the mind of the individual, naturally, becomes that which it is cognizing, i.e. God, or the active intellect. If all of this sounds a bit crazy and you're thinking to yourself, which Maimonides is this guy reading? I've never seen any of this stuff there. I'd recommend you go back and check out the previous classes where we laid out all of this in great detail with copious references and citations to both Maimonides' own words and the abundant scholarship unpacking these themes in his writings. I hope you enjoy. But the question now is, does Maimonides actually believe that this union of minds is possible? What are the limits of the human mind, according to Maimonides, and how far may the mind actually go in uniting with metaphysical entities and perhaps even with God? There's been much debate in the academic world about where Maimonides' limits on the human mind should be placed. Shlomo Pines, for example, a leading Maimonidean scholar, takes the harshest position in the debate, arguing that for Maimonides, the human mind is limited to knowledge in the material world, to that which is derived from matter, and has no access at all to anything beyond the material or physical realm, namely the metaphysical. Anything from beyond the physical, according to Pines' readings of Maimonides, can only be affirmed as a matter of faith, but never as a matter of concrete human knowledge. And as such, on his reading, there is no point in setting oneself the aim to intelligize or achieve conjunction with a separate intellect. It's simply not possible. Pines' position, which has been called either a metaphysical agnosticism or skepticism, namely that the human mind might not or cannot know anything of the metaphysical, including God, anything beyond the realm of physicality in which we belong, leaves us to read Maimonides and his final chapters of the guide with a sense of defeat, concluding that no positive knowledge can be gleaned of God at all. And because knowing from Maimonides, as per Aristotle as we just said, means uniting with, this would mean that if the human cannot know God, neither can they unite with God. because, as we've laid out in the earlier classes, it is through the mechanism of knowing something that one unites with it in the Aristotelian Maimonidean theory of the unity of the intellects, the unity of the subject, object, and act of cognition. To quote David Fried, if mystical union is a result of the identity of the intellect with the conceived object of knowledge, and even Moses could not conceive the true essence of God, then mystical union would seem to be impossible. We're left trapped down here in the sublunar realm to eat, sleep, drink, and die. Oh well. Other great Maimonidean scholars like Alexander Altman, for example, differ with Pines on this question and argue for a more optimistic Maimonidean theory of mind, which gives more hope to the further reaches of human metaphysical thinking. I'll throw up some of those sources on screen of the other scholars who weigh in on this question, so you can check them out and dive into them yourself for a bit of a deeper dive on this question. The basic logic behind those who take a position of metaphysical agnosticism in their reading of Maimonides, agnosticism literally meaning not knowing as in a from non or without, and gnostic as in knowing, in this context means that the human mind can neither know nor unite with God. The main reason standing behind this position is that the human mind, being finite, cannot come to know a God who transcends all categories and definitions, who harbors no multiplicity, whose very oneness and essence bears nothing in common with ours but the name. For Maimonides, it is reason that proves its own limits. Maimonides concedes that there must be a metaphysical reality, which acts as the necessary condition for our physical, perceivable reality, but because that metaphysical realm is imperceivable, we can know nothing of it, other than that it must exist. And the same goes for him for God. God, according to his thinking, is that which must exist for anything else at all to come into existence, but since God's existence is categorically other than ours, we can know nothing of God other simply that God is, but nothing at all about what God is. The peak of perfect knowledge about God is, as Maimonides puts it, that we cannot know God. The crux of this question of what Maimonides believes the human can know would seem to come down to a question of the intellect. If we can answer the question of what view Maimonides takes about the human intellect, we might be able to shed some light on what he believes its limits and furthest reaches are. But while this may seem like a sensible line of reasoning, it turns out not necessarily to be the most fruitful. The reason is because we get what seems to be somewhat of mixed messages from Maimonides about the question of the nature of the intellect. Throughout the guide, particularly in part 1, Maimonides refers to the intellect as both the divine, immortal aspect in mankind, the image of God in the human, the bond between us and God, and also describes God as the perfect intellect, making the interrelated claims that the intellect is the divine element within the human, that God is intellect, and that it is intellect which bonds and unites us with God. I'll put all of the sources in Maimonides' writings on screen for you to see where he says that all for yourself in case you don't believe me. Yet Maimonides, in a move that has been very difficult for his commentators and interpreters to interpret, seems to stick a pin in this inflated intellectual balloon by writing this in part 3 of the guide. For the same incapacity that prevents our intellects from apprehending God's essence also prevents them from apprehending God's knowledge of things as they are. For God's knowledge is not of the same species as ours, so that we can draw an analogy with regards to it, but it is a totally different thing. Between our knowledge and God's knowledge, there is nothing in common, as there is nothing in common between our essence and God's essence. With regards to this point, only the equivocality of the term knowledge occasions the error, for there is a commonality only in the terms, and only in the name that they share, whereas in the true reality of the things, there's a difference. Namely, that while we're using this one same word, intellect, to describe what's going on in the human mind and in the mind of God, they actually share nothing in common at all besides for the name. This staunch position of equivocation of the intellects certainly seems difficult to square with everything we just quoted from Maimonides about the unity of the human and the divine intellects. You can check out some of the creative ways scholars have attempted to square this circle of Maimonides' thought down here. Regardless of what you make of it, though, it's because of texts like these and others that many scholars come to the position that Maimonides, unlike his fellow mystics, the Sufis and the Kabbalists, believed that the human could not come to know and unite with God. If the human mind shares nothing in common with the divine mind and can know nothing of the divine essence, it certainly seems like any kind of union with God is precluded from taking place from the get-go. For the sake of thoroughness in giving the skeptical position its due, it's worth mentioning two more reasons why Maimonides might be doubtful about the individual's ability to unite with God. Firstly, as Adam Afterman and others have argued, the union of the kiss of death, which Maimonides speaks about in chapter 351 of the guide, which we discussed, is not a union that's achievable by ordinary people, but only by a very select few throughout history, and even for them, it's not a union achievable during their lifetime. It's only as they're dying and they're leaving their cumbersome bodies behind can they come to this union of the kiss of death. The second reason to be skeptical is that even if, on Maimonides' accounts, the human can unite with something beyond the realm of the physical, it does not seem like they can unite their minds with God, but only with the active intellect. The active intellect, for those who don't remember, is the last in a series of separate cosmic intellects which emanate from God, each one associated with one of the cosmic planetary spheres, which pass on the divine Fayed Shefa, the overflow emanating from God, at the head of the chain, down to the final sphere, the sphere of the moon, with its separate intellect, the active intellect, which in turn overflows the divine overflow which it receives from the spheres before it, and the intellects above it, on into our planetary sphere in consciousness, by which all intellection, actualization, inspiration, revelation, prophecy, and providence, down here under the moon in the sublunar realm, here on planet Earth, takes place, making the active intellect, this last intellect in the great chain of intellects, the final bridge between heaven and earth, and, from our perspective, the first rung on the cosmic ladder, back from our minds up to the cause of all causes, back to God. The question then is, when the human contemplates the metaphysical realms, and in doing so unites with something beyond the physical, if that's possible, are they uniting with God or only with the active intellect? And, if it is the latter, in what way are we to understand this active intellect? Is it in some way to be seen as divine, such as that union with it might be considered a mystical union, a unio mystica? Those are the two questions we're going to address now. With that first question of whether the human is uniting with the active intellect or with God, we're stepping into an already well-defined debate amongst Maimonides' predecessors and contemporaries, of which he would have been well aware. For Al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, Ibn Tufail, and to some degree Al-Kindi, it is possible, at least in theory, for the human to unite with God. Not that it's easy, but at least it's possible. However, for Al-Farabi, Ibn Bajjah, and Ibn Rushd on the other hand, the highest possible human union is only with the active intellect, not with God. Which camp Maimonides belongs to in this debate depends on how one is going to read him, and we'll see some of those readings in just a moment. As for the second question, about how we're to understand the active intellect in its relation to God, namely in what way might it be considered divine, Maimonides makes it clear that even the first of the separate intellects, the highest intellect of the highest sphere, is a created, or more precisely emanated being, and a contingent being, namely that it happens to exist, but it didn't have to exist, and is not to be confused with God, whom Maimonides refers to as the uncaused necessary of existence. That which must exist, without which nothing else could exist, which brought all else into existence and was not brought into existence by anything else. And if this categorical distinction is true for the first intellect, it is true all the more so for the final of the separate intellects, our favorite intellect, the active intellect. The active intellect is only an intermediary agent and channel through which the divine flows, not God itself. However, having said all that, Maimonides does seem to blur the lines a little at times by writing on occasion that the divine science, aka metaphysics, consists of apprehension of the active intellect, and elsewhere as the apprehension of God. And again, in 351 in the guide, Maimonides speaks of the pinnacle and perfection of human worship with the palace metaphor that we went through of the individual coming closer to the king, which we assume from the rest of the chapter means God. But then in the next chapter, in 352, Maimonides seems to imply that the king which the individual approaches in the previous chapter is actually the active intellect. And then 2 chapters later, in 354, the last chapter of the guide, Maimonides goes back to speaking of the apprehension of God as the highest human perfection, but that God cannot be fully apprehended. But then if we wind back to guide 236, there Maimonides refers to the active intellect as the highest degree of human perfection available to mankind. What is going on here? Let's try and make some sense of all this. It seems that what's happening here is that while for Maimonides there certainly is a categorical difference between God and the active intellect, the former is God, the necessary existent, and the latter is merely an emanation from God, whose existence is contingent upon God. But the active intellect for Maimonides, as for his Muslim predecessors, while not being a deity, is divine in some sense. And they, Maimonides included, call it as such, calling it the divine active intellect. The reason for this, and the key perhaps to understand what's going on here in the guide, with Maimonides jumping back and forth between speaking of union with God and then of union with the active intellect, is that Maimonides sees the active intellect as the human's source of cognition and prophecy, inspiration and revelation, receiving and channeling the divine overflow flowing from God and uniting through it the human with God. And because of its role as the final rung between the metaphysical and the physical realms, between God and the world, and the conduit of the divine overflow through which all of our inspiration, contemplation, revelation takes place, the portal of the intellect through which the human unites with God, our point of contact with the divine, the active intellect often gets depicted as a stand-in for God and the thing with which the human unites. I think that a helpful way of thinking about this might be to speak about what is happening right here and right now. You at this moment are watching me and are connecting to me through my words and thoughts, and in doing so there's something of a union and a connection between you and I, which I'm very grateful for. But there are many steps that need to take place for that to happen. I need to speak to the camera, the footage needs to be uploaded via my router and modem after it's edited, off to Google and YouTube servers, and from there again retrieved by your Wi-Fi network onto your screen, to your device, into your brain via your eyes and ears. I'm no computer scientist, but that's a rough estimate of what's happening here. So yes, you and I are connecting, but you could also say that you're connecting to your device, or that your device is connecting to your Wi-Fi, whichever you want to consider the final destination of my thoughts to your brain, not unlike the active intellect, which is the final destination of the divine overflow to the human mind. So in this moment, are you connecting to your Wi-Fi or to me? Well, both. Not unlike the individual in Maimonides' philosophy who connects to God via the medium of the active intellect, and is therefore described at times as connecting to God and at times as connecting to the active intellect, because in reality it's both. It is to God via the active intellect. I hope that made some sense. And by the way, any comparison made there between myself and God was merely accidental. I apologize for that. It was just a handy metaphor. To put this in other words, since the active intellect is an emanation from God, it remains valid to talk about unio mystica, a mystical union, whether it is unification with God or with God's proximal emanation, the active intellect, and Maimonides' choice to speak of it as one or the other throughout the guide simply reflects the tension between the religious ideal of uniting with God, as per Deuteronomy 11:22, and the philosophical insight into the limitations of the human intellect. One last thing to consider here is the real possibility that Maimonides as a thinker grew and changed over time, over the years, as humans do, and that his thought on the possibility of union with God shifted from a more optimistic evaluation earlier on in his life to a more doubtful, skeptical position later on. One scholar who takes this position is Adam Ofterman, who writes, "We find a clear difference between the early Maimonides, whose writing is deeply influenced by Ibn Sina, and the later Maimonides, who most probably rejects the entire Neo-Aristotelian project, typified by thinkers like Ibn Rushd, Ibn Tufayl, and Ibn Bajjah, of knowledge as union, even with the active intellect." According to Ofterman, whereas earlier on Maimonides believed that the human could cleave to the active intellect, and in their dying could become part of the metaphysical realm of separate intellects, leading ultimately to a permanent union with God, by the time of his later writings in the guide, Maimonides had become more critical and skeptical of the entire project of knowledge as union, the possibility of uniting with metaphysical entities through knowledge of them. Nuancing things, however, just a little, Ofterman writes, the technical terminology of communion, itisal, and union, itihad, with the active intellect is shared by both the early and later Maimonidean writings, with itisal, communion or cleaving, used to describe the level of conjunction possible during one's lifetime while in their physical body, and itihad, union, to describe the relationship achievable in death. but both the early and later Maimonides present the dynamics of communion, itisal, and noetic union with the active intellect, including a very important discussion in which union with the active intellect at the moment of death is described as the ultimate human perfection. I wasn't entirely sure while reading Oftman what his position was here about what Maimonides held about union with the active intellect, particularly in his early works during one's lifetime, so I found Adam and asked him. What he said was this, that in his opinion, while for Maimonides the individual may be in relation with and even commune with the active intellect during their lifetimes, Maimonides does not believe that one can unite with the active intellect until they die and say goodbye to their bodies, except perhaps in the rare case of Moses. Nor does Maimonides have any room at all in his system for the individual to unite with God, and that all of his strong religious, erotic feelings and desire, his cheshek as he calls it, is always reserved only for God, while his metaphysical and noetic mechanisms of communion and eventually union in death, what Maimonides calls dveikut, is directed solely towards the active intellect. I would like to thank Adam for being so sweet with his time and generous with his thoughts, and for entertaining my difference of opinion. For a veteran scholar in the field who's been working and publishing on the subject for decades, to genuinely hear out the disagreement of some whippersnapper who he barely knows that rocked up to his office, to listen and thoughtfully reply represents, as far as I'm concerned, the finest of intellectual maturity, honesty, humility, and generosity. My hat goes off to you, Professor Afterman. Despite all this, Oftman does believe that Maimonides cannot be said to be presenting a form of either philosophical mysticism or mystical philosophy, and he describes him as a rather conservative philosopher who does not promote any kind of integration or attachment to God. Because, to wrap up and summarize the case that we've made up until now, firstly, Maimonides' unit of language, in Oftman's opinion, is restricted solely to the active intellect, which is not God, but only a mediating emanation from God, and even then, only at the moment of death for the individual. And secondly, because Maimonides, unlike many other medieval Jewish thinkers, does not allow for any form of attachment with God, partial or complete, and doesn't promote or encourage the individual to pursue such states of mystical union or communion with God at all, according to Afterman. And thirdly, as we've mentioned, because Oftman believes that Maimonides makes a careful distinction between his use of technical metaphysical language and his emotional religious language, between the religious language of love and eros, of which God is the only object and recipient of those loving, erotic religious feelings, and distinguishes that from the language of noetic, cognitive, conjunction and union, which, according to Oftman, is simply technical metaphysical language, which refers only to and is directed only to the active intellect. And therefore, God is not the subject of Maimonides' unit of language, neither of itisal or itihad, and can only be loved from a distance on Afterman's reading. Sarah Pesson seconds this line of thinking when she writes, "The most straightforward account of what Maimonides is up to here in Guide 351 remains entirely non-mystical, purely in line with an Islamic, Neoplatonized Aristotelian epistemological tradition of overflow and conjunction. Namely, that what we have here is a technical, non-personal description of the completion of the dynamic communion between the human and the active intellect, according to Afterman, the highest of human perfection, wherein the human intellect comes into full alignment with the active intellect, according to Pesson, a purely philosophical, metaphysical process, nothing mystical going on here at all to see. Move right along." However, having said that, it seems that there is another possible reading of Maimonides' thought to explore here. David Fried, a great young scholar to whom I owe a lot of the direction of this episode and the series in general, argues that this position of a radical metaphysical skepticism or agnosticism in Maimonides' thought is not the only appropriate reading of Maimonides' philosophy and his negative theology, and that in fact a deep mysticism of the apophatic flavor is an equally legitimate outcome of Maimonides' not knowing, in which the individual, realizing the fundamental limits of the rational human mind and knowledge, instead unites with God in a place beyond where the mind can go, in the deep reaches of the heart, in their love and fear of God, which for Maimonides is its own way of knowing, as we laid out in last episode. Fried believes that this is indeed the direction Maimonides takes his negative theology, and his assessment of the limits of the human mind, not in the direction of a radical skepticism and agnosticism about things metaphysical and the nature of God, but rather into a deeply profound mystical silence and towards an alternative, direct experience of God beyond the limits of human language and the mind. And this opens up the door to what I think is the real issue here. It seems to me that the problem with this whole discussion is that while it seems like we're all discussing the same thing, namely the possibility of the union of the human with the divine, it's entirely possible that we're not actually at all talking about the same thing, because there may actually be two divinities at play here in Maimonides' thought. One with which we are able to unite, and the second with which we can most definitely not. And ironically, I think it's actually with the second god, with the one that we can't unite with, that Maimonides' true mysticism might just lie. Hear me out. Earlier in the series in episode 6, we laid out a certain peculiarity of Maimonides' theology. Just to recap ever so briefly, Maimonides, from his earliest philosophical writings, while still in his late teens and early 20s, considers Aristotle, whom he simply calls the philosopher, to be his philosophical master and mentor par excellence. And until much later in life, at least deep into the guide, Maimonides seems to remain a committed Aristotelian, as interpreted by and filtered through the Andalusian Islamic philosophical tradition to which he belonged, adopting both Aristotle's logic, epistemology, ethics, physics, metaphysics, cosmology, and theology. But about that last subject on the list, Aristotle's theology, did Aristotle write a work of theology? If you watch the 6th episode in the series, you know that there was a highly influential text circulating around during the Middle Ages called the Theology of Aristotle. But as you'll also know if you've been following the series, spoiler alert, this text, the Theology of Aristotle, had nothing to do directly with Aristotle. It was a 9th century translation and adaptation of a 3rd century text from the pen of Porphyry, a student of Plotinus, the father of Neoplatonism. This text, the Enneads, was the seminal collection of Plotinus' teachings and the primary text of Neoplatonism for hundreds of years to come, which happens to be a very non-Aristotelian, instead mystical school of philosophy, and one of the primary influences on all of Western philosophical mysticism, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, and Maimonidean. Maimonides, as we discussed at great length in episode 6, was exposed to the philosophical thought of Neoplatonism as found in the so-called Theology of Aristotle, the treasure house of Platinian doctrine, which had circulated in the Islamic world since the time of Al-Kindi, the first Muslim philosopher, which were fairly ubiquitous in the intellectual circles of Islamic culture with which Maimonides was intimate, through the intermediacy of the Muslim school of Neoplatonized Aristotelian philosophers, most notably Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, and from the 12th century Fatimid and immediate post-Fatimid Egypt Shia theology with its Neoplatonic leanings and borrowings which, according to Alfred Ivry, could not have escaped Maimonides' attention. One of the major notions that Maimonides adopts from the Muslim Neoplatonists, besides for his theory of emanation, is a Neoplatonic mystical concept of God, as opposed to the God that Maimonides gets from Aristotle, God as the first cause, prime mover, and the thinker thinking itself, in whose thinking the whole world is actualized into being. The God that Maimonides gets from the Neoplatonists, on the other hand, is utterly simple, unknowable, and indescribable. It is beyond any human categories of thought or reason. It is beyond being itself, such as even to say that it is already highly philosophically problematic. Never mind to try to describe what it is by attributing any attributes to it, like, for example, calling it a self-intelligizing intellect, thinking the world into being, that we could never do such a thing. The problem is that Maimonides adopts both of these gods, the thinking god of Aristotle and the unthinkable god of Plotinus, into his theology, and because he belongs to a tradition working off a misattributed text, it's not clear that he even knows that he has two radically different concepts of God lurking beneath the surface. In fact, he seems rather to amalgamate them into one. Maimonides, it seems, sees no contradiction between his affirming that God is intellect, in whose self-knowledge the world comes into being, and his adamant insistence, on the other hand, that God is absolutely simple and united beyond any positive categorical descriptions or attributes at all. If you'd like to see some of the attempts that scholars have made to resolve this contradiction, check out some of their works down here. But to say that these two concepts of God don't sit great with one another might be the philosophical understatement of the century. They seem, to the careful reader, to be entirely incompatible, and the seemingly irresolvable contradictions between them seem to fuel much of the deep tensions in the guide, making the text an impossibly mysterious and puzzling book for its readers. We can see these two gods and this dual theology at play in Maimonides' thought. Once you know it's there, it's really hard not to see it. We can see it in his seemingly contradictory talk about God being reachable, knowable, and unitable with, and then in the next breath as being unreachable, unknowable, and incapable of being united with. Seemingly contradictory language, which a dual conception of divinity nicely reconciles. We can see it also, to pay homage to last episode, in the dual metaphors of light employed by Maimonides, the light of the intellect, the light of cognition, through which we come to see reality clearly, corresponding to and flowing from the intelligible God of Aristotle, versus the blinding light which overwhelms our minds in its dazzling beauty, in whose presence we are left dumb and silent, for to you silence is praise, in the dark face of the God of Plotinus. I would like to thank Levi Morrow for that observation. Thank you, Levi. So when we ask, does Maimonides believe that the individual can unite with God, we first have to ask, which God? Just a bit of a disclaimer, what follows from this point on is some new thoughts that haven't been fully articulated yet in that good peer-reviewed scholarship as far as I'm aware, so take them with a grain of salt. These are thoughts that have emerged from discussions with some wonderfully thoughtful peers who have given a lot of diligent attention to the subject, doing the exhilarating detective work of following Maimonides through his texts, through the labyrinth of his thought, into his sources and philosophical influences, trying to piece together the puzzle that is Maimonides' mind. In that regard, I would like to highlight three friends in particular, David Fried, Levi Morrow, and Menachem Ladowitz, and thank them for helping me think through these issues together. Thank you guys. And I would like to add a thank you to Jeffrey Radin, who Menachem put me onto, who also helped me think through some of these thoughts. Thank you, Jeff. Okay, here it goes. Maimonides, as we've been saying, seems at times to be saying that a person can come to know and hence unite with God, and at other times seems to deny that possibility altogether. It seems like the most plausible explanation to make sense of what's going on here, as we've started to say, is to tease apart the two God concepts at play in the mind of Maimonides, which he most certainly does not see as two separate concepts, which is part of the Great Confusion. The first God, the God of Aristotle, God as intellect, which generates all of existence by thinking it from potential into actuality, which is described metaphorically as turning the first sphere, generating the subsequent series of spheres, each with their own separate intellect, up until the final sphere with her separate intellect, the active intellect, which cognitively unites us humans with the divine intellectual overflow by which all cognition, inspiration, providence, and revelation take place. And insofar as any of these cognitive religious phenomena are possible, and Maimonides certainly seems to think that they are, insofar as they are possible and take place, it is through the union or communion of the human mind with the divine active intellect, the divine mind, by which they take place, as Maimonides makes explicit. And to take this one step further, insofar as the active intellect is united with and plugged into the chain of cosmic intellects, and the stream of consciousness, the cosmic intelligence flowing through them, stretching all the way back to God, it seems fair to say that the human uniting with the active intellect, even becoming the active intellect, as Maimonides writes on occasion, means that the human unites with God by placing themselves in noetic cognitive relation with that chain and stream during one's lifetime, and then fully placing themselves into that chain, into that stream metaphysically in one's death. They're effectively uniting themselves with God, who sits upstream at the top of the chain, emanating the flow onwards through the active intellect, uniting with that stream, and uniting therefore with the source which is emanating that stream, God. Insofar, and this is important, insofar as God is conceived as intellect, namely on an Aristotelian conception of God, that is how the mystical union would function. What we have here, perhaps, is a superb marriage of Maimonides' Aristotelian rationalism with his mysticism, perhaps without him even knowing it, creating one of the finest syntheses and contradictions that would go on to perplex and inspire generations of scholars from Abraham Abulafia to Baruch Spinoza. And this union that we're describing now also works particularly well on a strictly Aristotelian, non-Neoplatonized system, where beyond the physical realm there's only one divine substance, where all divisions of the noetic realm collapse into one intellect, and once one cleaves to that intellect, they're de facto also cleaving to God as intellect, because there are no degrees of separation on that Aristotelian system. And thank you again to Adam Afterman for pointing this out to me. That is all on the Aristotelian account. However, the God of Plotinus, of Neoplatonism, who is utterly simple and beyond any human category, whom we can barely even apply the category of existence to, an utterly inconceivable, unthinkable, indescribable black box, the unfathomable abyss in Strauss's coinage, which shatters our parameters, boundaries, and borders, reason, and language. To say that one can know such a God and in doing so unite with it is just completely ridiculous. To spell this out a little clearer, if union happens through knowing something, the two minds becoming one subject, object, and activity of thought, as it does for Maimonides, then no union is possible with that which cannot be known, and therefore no union is possible with God, insofar as God is conceptualized as precisely that which cannot be conceptualized, namely, insofar as we are talking about the God of Plotinus and Neoplatonism. This brings us to what I think is one of the great theological ironies in Maimonides' thought. Whereas Aristotle, throughout the history of thought, is conceptualized as the great rationalist, the realist, and the scientist, and Plato, particularly as filtered through Neoplatonism, is seen as the idealist and the mystic, here what we're getting ironically is a form of Aristotelian mysticism and a Platonian formulation which seems to preclude a, at least noetic mysticism from flourishing at all. And it is Aristotelianism which does go on, in fact, to inspire hundreds of years of religious rationalism, as evident in the seminal figures of Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina in Islam, Maimonides and Gershonides in Judaism, Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas in Christianity, and Plato via Plotinus and Neoplatonism conversely goes on to influence just about all subsequent Western mysticism, including but not limited to Sufism, Illuminationism, and Ismailism in Islam, through the figures of Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Tufayl, and others, to Kabbalah in Judaism, from Isaac the Blind to Yochanan Alamano, through the figures of Ibn Gabriel and, ironically, Maimonides, to Christian mysticism through the figures of Augustine and Pseudo-Dionysius, to Marcello Ficino and Pico della Mirandola during the Renaissance, to the Cambridge Platonists, to Leibniz, to Spinoza, to Schopenhauer, to the Transcendentalists and the German Idealists, up into the mystically inclined 20th century philosophers, thinkers like Whitehead, Bergson, Husserl, and Heidegger. The Neoplatonic mystical tradition runs long and deep throughout history. If Western philosophy can be most safely categorized as footnotes to Plato, as Whitehead puts it, then we can most safely characterize Western mysticism as footnotes to Plotinus. And Aristotle, on this schema, would have to be characterized as the primary text for all of Western rationalism, particularly religious rationalism, which would be then all footnotes to Aristotle. The great irony here in Maimonides' thought, then, just to spell it out once more, is that the God with whom the individual might be able to noetically unite with, according to the guide, via the agency of the active intellect, also known as the agent intellect, is precisely the God of Aristotle, God as conceived as intellect, leaving any hope for Maimonides' mysticism hinged upon the very non-mystical theology of Aristotle, his actual theology, that is, not the book going by that title. And on the flip side, the God which the human cannot know, and therefore cannot unite with, seemingly putting Maimonides beyond the bounds of mysticism, is precisely the God of Plotinus, the founding father of Western mysticism. The irony of all of this is just too much to handle, and makes a mockery of our categories of mysticism and rationalism, even when they're well defined, with Aristotle the rationalist God giving us Maimonides the mystic, and Plotinus the mystic's God giving us Maimonides the skeptic. Here, it's precisely Maimonides' rationalism, his belief in the capacity of the human mind to obtain knowledge of metaphysical entities, insofar as he believes that that is possible, which makes him a mystic, and his mystical theology, with a God beyond reason, which leaves him a skeptic. I'm being a bit crude here, obviously, because skepticism and mysticism aren't mutually exclusive. One can very much be a skeptic agnostic, doubtful of the capacity of the human mind to obtain any knowledge about God, and still be a mystic. In fact, we have a name for just that kind of mysticism. It's called apophatic mysticism, a subset of negative theology, or yediyat hashlila in Hebrew. As Maimonides himself writes, with every additional negation one comes nearer to the apprehension of God, that is, if one ever ultimately gets there. There is no reason why a deep and profound skepticism, and even agnosticism, cannot go hand in hand with a real and profound mysticism. Whether it be the Buddhist who practices a discipline of doubt in order to become free of attachment to fixed appearances, essences, and viewpoints, and in doing so finds peace and equanimity, suspending judgment and letting go of dogmatic beliefs to live with the impermanence and unpredictability of life, embracing doubt and emptiness over dogma and attachment, or the Taoist Zhongso's linguistically oriented skepticism circling around an unknowable absolute called the Tao, which if spoken is not the true Tao, in the East, or the mystics in the West in agony and delight, lost in the cloud of unknowing, striving after a God they cannot know, and an experience they cannot articulate even to themselves. Or even someone like Thomas Aquinas, one of, if not the most influential Catholic theologians of all time, the Maimonides of Christianity, if you will, who, from what we can tell, seems to have some sort of mystical experience on the 6th of December, 1273, and as a result, discontinued his dictation of his major life work, the massive Summa Theologica, which Carl Becker would call one of the most amazing and stupendous products of the human mind, leaving it ultimately unfinished. In response to his secretary and friend, Reginald of Piperno, asking and then begging him to continue, Thomas, after swearing his friend to secrecy, replied, "Reginald, I can write no more, for all that I have written now seems to me like straw, compared to the things that I have seen and have been revealed to me." And it is on that silent, enigmatic note, a retreat from words, that Aquinas leaves his life work unfinished, his copious words about God paling in comparison, like chaff and straw, to what he had experienced firsthand. 3 months later, it is said, while giving commentary on the Song of Songs, Aquinas, the doctor of the church, would pass away from this world into eternal silence, from chaff and straw to eternal wordless truth. Now, while we have no evidence to suggest a parallel late-stage conversion to mysticism or mystical experience as the cause of Maimonides' own retreat into silence, wordlessness, and skepticism, we get to glimpse this cross-cultural affinity between skeptical silence and mystical agnosticism. And it's no surprise, given that the apophatic mystic spends their days negating all else, images, words, concepts, pleasures, and rewards, negating all else but that one that cannot be negated and cannot be known, putting the mystery back in mysticism. Perhaps the only thing really dividing the skeptic and the mystic, if there is any, is just their personal disposition in relation to the grand mystery of being, the former inclined to pessimism, the latter an optimist. And this is Maimonides' Platinian mysticism, his mysticism which circles the God of the mystics, never able to reach and unite his mind with it, but always circling around it, propelled by the heart, which always wants its object of desire but never gets it, never resting inside its gates, and yet never tires of yearning, pining, and reaching for it. A mysticism beyond knowledge, reaching for the God of the unknown, reaching beyond the rational boundaries of the human mind, through a mystical darkness, to grasp the rationally incomprehensible, a God so utterly unknowable that all of our knowledge can only be an unknowing, a knowing of what God is not, an infinite journey towards a God so far beyond any concepts, shattering all categories, leaving us wanting in the depths of silent contemplation. We might be able to say that what we get here is not just one simple mysticism from Maimonides, but that we just stumbled upon what may be Maimonides' dual mysticism, one a mysticism of knowing, and the second a mysticism of unknowing. You can take your pick in this choose-your-own theological adventure of a lifetime. To take things just one step further, for those of you that have gotten this far in the adventure, as we mentioned earlier, while we can retrospectively look back and tease out these two different gods in the mind of Maimonides, with the benefit of 8 centuries of study and scholarship since his passing, it's not clear at all that Maimonides was aware of this dual theological inheritance of his. Remember, it would only be another 500 years after the Guide was finished until the Theology of Aristotle was identified as Platonic, and another century and a half until it was pinned down as Neoplatonic. Maimonides, indeed, as Al-Kindi and others had tried before him, attempts, knowingly or unknowingly, to merge these two concepts of God, the God of Aristotle and the God of Plotinus, into one God, undoubtedly the cause of much creative philosophical and religious tension in his philosophy. This merger is evident on many occasions throughout his writings, see Guide 153 for example, in his insistence that God is one with God's knowledge in ways that we mere humans cannot comprehend. Just to quote one example from an earlier text of Maimonides, which he wrote sometime in his 20s or early 30s, known as Shmona Prakim, the 8 chapters, a beautiful work of ethics and philosophy which functioned as his introduction to Tractate Avot in his first major work of Jewish scholarship ever, his commentary on the Mishnah. In the last of the 8 chapters, Maimonides writes, "It is axiomatic in metaphysics that human reason, which is imperfect, cannot fully fathom God's being, which is perfect. Our reason is as unable to comprehend God as our eyes are unable to gaze at the sun. The human cannot comprehend God's knowledge, for God is one with God's knowledge, and God's knowledge is one with God. Both are one and the same. All that we can comprehend is that just as we know that God exists, so do we know that God knows. And if asked, what is the nature of God's knowledge, we answer that we do not know any more than we know about the nature of God's true essence. What we're left to deal with at the end of the day in Maimonides' final philosophical product is not one God or the other, one mystical or philosophical path or the other, but a beautifully tortured, complex amalgamation of the two. And this is to say nothing, by the way, of his third and really first God, the God of Abraham, which Maimonides goes through great lengths and pains to merge with his philosophical God or gods, which he must if he's to have a God with whom there's any capacity for a personal relationship and for religion to be built around, and which may also introduce a third path, even a third mystical path perhaps, into the already crowded mix, but we will leave that for another time. There is no denying that agnosticism and epistemic humility, saying that we do not know and cannot know, is an important part of Maimonides' system, with nearly every time that Maimonides speaks about God's knowledge and knowledge of God, qualifying himself by saying, according to the capacity of the human mind to know. And if we take him seriously, this isn't just some cutesy expression of religious piety, but a reflection of his deep epistemic skepticism and humility. And this deep humility, evident throughout his work, goes on to impact the rest of medieval thought and shape all subsequent Jewish theology and philosophy. The question just is, where does Maimonides' agnostic skepticism lead him? Does it, as Shlomo Pines and others suggest, leave him to conclude the guide with an abandonment of metaphysics and a betrayal of the theological enterprise he spent a lifetime building, and instead turn his attention to practical politics and social concerns about how to best organize society and live in relation to one another? Or does it lead Maimonides into the pinnacle of the practice of mysticism, by which I don't mean magic, I mean rather mysticism made practical in the form of ethics, in guiding our lives in relation to one another, in line with the highest calling of mysticism and religion, to imitate God and to treat the other as no less than an image of the divine made manifest in the flesh, an ethics of love, care, and concern, not as a result of an abandonment of theology and metaphysics, but a direct consequence demanded by their highest reaches. To find out, join us in the next episode where we'll be talking about the goal and completion of Maimonides' guide. And until then, remember, when in doubt, metaphysical or otherwise, be kind. Just a short afternote here. This video took a lot longer to make because I made that great mistake of going back to read some more Maimonides and Maimonidean scholarship. The problem of doing that is because you can feel like you basically have things figured out and just want to check a thing or two just to make sure, only to realize that you really know nothing at all and probably shouldn't open your mouth, my mouth, to talk about the subject. So I would like to admit here, alongside great company, my true ignorance and how truly little I know about the subject. The only thing calming my conscience in releasing so uncertain an episode is my ability to conclude it with a recommendation to please check out the text and scholars for yourself and come to your own conclusions. Consider yourself recommended. I would like to thank you all for joining us again. It is a pleasure to connect and maybe even unite with you. I hope you enjoyed this episode and it left you with some food for thought. Please, if I made any mistakes, correct me down in the comment section. Thank you so much to our patrons who so generously and kindly support this work that we're doing here at the channel, allowing us to continue to produce this content, which I hope is worth something and valuable. Thank you all for joining us again to learn, to think, to explore, and as always, keep seeking.